We're going to do geolocation pushes in order to drive activation. So this is the feature that we wanted to build. And for us, the solutioning process in terms of where build versus buy would come in is how do we implement that geolocation, right? How do we
Yeah.
know what stores are nearby, where people are? And so that was where the build versus buy came in.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty tricky problem, but also a problem that I feel like a lot of like technical engineers would be just drooling over to solve, right? Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at manggit@useanvil.com. That's MANGGIT@useanvil.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode. And I will share that with Schaefer, and it should be good. Sound good?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, here we go. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Build vs. Buy podcast. My name is Manggit Ng. I am the co-founder and CEO of Anvil, the fastest way to build software for documents. And today I have Aakash Gupta as my guest. He is a content creator of the Product Growth newsletter and formerly the VP of Product at Apollo.io, as well as the head of product at Affirm. So thank you for being on the show today, Aakash.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so really looking forward to diving in on your past experiences. But before we start, why don't you give a more in-depth background of yourself and what you do, and share with the audience here a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. After 16 years in product management, I'm doing my own thing. It's a business around my content. So I built up over the last 4 years 200K plus following on LinkedIn, 100K plus on Twitter. And this gave me like a really good distribution channel. And what is like kind of one of the most, in the age of AI, what is like really a great advantageous thing for people? It's distribution. And so off that distribution, I created a newsletter, which currently has 137,000 subscribers, and a podcast. So those are the two things I do. I tend to like kind of my niche within the world is just bridging my experience as a PM, which was at the
Hmm.
intersection of B2B and B2C, but always focused on product growth. And so hence the name Product Growth.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, especially with AI making content generation so easy these days, the distribution just becomes that much more critical to success, I guess, right? Like you need a place to put that content that's being generated, especially as we're all overwhelmed with content these days. Just so many things you can never keep up.
Yeah, there's so many great PMs, founders, operators with stories to tell. So that distribution is really important, I think, to actually getting that story out there.
Yeah. Would love to actually, before we dive into the meat of today's podcast, would love to understand a little bit more about how you built up that following. Was it like, I assume it was a deliberate act of, nurturing and building up a following, and kind of like what led you to think of this as something that you wanted to do?
Yeah, I'll take that in two parts. So how I built the following, and then what led me to go for it. So in terms of what led me to build up this following, there was obviously the aha moment, which was I posted on LinkedIn, and this was something that I would have posted in the COVID era just at my company. And, maybe 10 or 12 people who are responsible for my promotion might think more highly of me. But I posted on LinkedIn, Roblox is the Shopify of gaming. And boom, 12,000 people read it. It's like, whoa, okay, there's something here. And in 2020, like competition on LinkedIn was pretty small. There were very, very few content creators compared to today. And so
Mhm.
I was able to get that distribution right off the bat, even though I had no followers. LinkedIn said, "Oh, this is quality content. Let me show it to people." And so I'm turned on creator mode, which was kind of the new thing at the time. They were
Mhm.
really, really promoting it. And I started acquiring followers, one of the earliest people to acquire followers. And what I really learned over time that I think most people don't internalize is taking marketing concepts and bringing them to content creation. So, what do marketers think about? They think about top of the funnel, middle funnel, bottom of funnel, for instance. So, in
Mhm.
terms of top of the funnel content, I would create content that was purely aimed at acquiring followers. So, that's
Mhm.
like talking about trending tech topics that have really nothing to do with my niche, or telling stories about entrepreneurs. For instance, like my most famous post of all time has something, I don't know, like 15 million impressions, 135,000 likes on LinkedIn, is the story of the Sriracha founder. He
Mhm.
doesn't even operate a tech business, but I've told his story. So that's top of the funnel content that acquires you followers. Also, it gets the algorithm to just like you. It's very, very
Mhm.
important to incorporate that. And I feel like 99% of creators don't create that content. Then there's the middle of the funnel content. So this is stuff that's going to get people aware of my offer, but I'm not putting my offer like in their face. And for the longest time, what was my offer? It was a free subscription to a free newsletter. So it's not even like it's a very deep offer, but it's just like this middle of the funnel content would be like excerpts, for instance, from a particular newsletter. If I had written a 6,000 word newsletter on how Coinbase grows, maybe I'd have a 3,000 character post on how Coinbase builds product. So
Mhm.
again, not like in your face, like go read Coinbase Grows, but here's some awesome value. And then there was some bottom of the funnel content. Bottom of the funnel content, like go read my article. Like
Yeah.
I'm writing a post that's like a hook for 3,000 characters, and now I want you to go read it. So I created this mix and I actually rotated from top of funnel, mid funnel, bottom of funnel every day. So
Mhm.
posting every single day for 4 years with this rotation of content has really been kind of the most important flywheel for me, because in the end, when I started to create more CTAs around, for instance, supporting my advertisers or
Yeah.
subscribing to my paid newsletter or listening to my podcast or visiting me on YouTube, people were like ready. As Alex Hormozy says, build trust first, then ask. I'd been giving away free stuff for 3 years. So once I started asking the last year, people are totally ready to do it because I've given them so much value over time. So that's the first component. The second component around how did I decide to do this on my own and go for it? For
Yeah.
me, I was lucky enough that I was able to grow this side hustle while I was head of product, VP of product, director of product, all these roles. And so I was able to basically get my compensation too right below the level of that VP of product. Apollo.io was a unicorn startup. So you can just look up what those types of people make. That's what I was making. And I could see that there's much more room to go much higher if I go full
Mhm.
time. And on top of that, having control over my schedule, my day, my time, having that itch to be an entrepreneur is kind of a no-brainer decision.
Mhm. It's funny, there's so many good nuggets in there. I feel like you telling the story of the Sriracha founder, which is it's interesting because he doesn't do a great job of telling his own story. It feels like, right? Like everybody talks about the Sriracha founder and now about how the farm that provides the farm that provides the peppers are they're like they're like in a legal lawsuit right now. But then also becoming kind of an influencer on LinkedIn, which is I feel like LinkedIn is still probably I mean, it's getting heavily mined now. I think there's a lot of people on LinkedIn posting things, but it's still probably early enough innings that somebody can still establish themselves. Whereas like on Twitter or like YouTube or some of these other content platforms, there's already big players. There's already people that have a following. So getting into that top 1%, a quarter of a percent of people to like actually make a living off it seems harder and harder. LinkedIn definitely still feels like there's some room. I've seen it for myself, just like naturally. I post things on LinkedIn and organically I've gained a handful of followers and it's growing, but it's definitely there's still room, but also it's kind of maturing now. So I feel like what's next? What's the next platform that especially B2B content creators are going to be looking for? I think that's the open question, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any insights on that before we dive into the next part of this podcast.
I don't think there is anything on the horizon. People said it might be Threads, it might be TikTok. The YouTube actually has come back in vogue over the last year too for B2B content. I don't think any three of those channels are nearly as good as LinkedIn. What actually LinkedIn did is like big creators like me, like we've
Hmm.
seen a drop in impressions of roughly a half. You can look at Richard DeBlome or any of the stats on this. Like, so I
Hmm.
was like ranked like the number 11 LinkedIn creator in the world for a really, really long time, right? All of us people in that tier, we have seen like roughly a half drop in reach because LinkedIn is willing to reward smaller creators like you. It's willing to
Hmm.
let you guys grow. If you go look at an Instagram or a YouTube, that isn't the case. On YouTube, what's taking off right now, like the Modern Wisdom podcast, it went from 2.5 million to 2.7 million, 75 million in a month. On YouTube, the big get bigger. The
Yeah.
small guys have a really hard time going from 2,500 followers to 2,750 followers. On LinkedIn, it just takes one good post to get those
Hmm.
250 followers, even if you have 2,500 followers. In fact, I've coached several people. In fact, today I was at lunch with somebody. He was a really big Medium writer. And I just
Hmm.
took one of his Medium articles in less than 5 minutes and created a LinkedIn post for him that's gotten 455 likes already. And he'd never had a post with more than 20 likes. So if you
Mm.
figure out what works on LinkedIn and you know how to create that type of content, and by the way, it's very obvious, just go look at any of my last four posts and see what I do on all four of those posts, then you can succeed.
Got it. Well, okay. Well, so there is hope for the little guys out there, and LinkedIn's building the optionality for virality or the opportunity for virality into their platform. Great. Well, let's kind of switch gears a little bit and dive into the meat of today's podcast. Would love to have you bring up a time that you were building a product feature, internal tool. I'm just kind of share the background a little bit. What company was it? What were you building? And then maybe talk a little bit about the solutioning process before you kind of dove into the build versus buy decision.
Yeah, so at Affirm, when I was heading up the product growth team, one of our main objectives was getting people to take like second and third loans with Affirm. Because what would
Hmm.
happen is we'd acquire a lot of people for their first loan at Shopify or Amazon. They
Hmm.
controlled most of the e-commerce in the US. We also had Walmart a couple years before. So we had the top three leading e-commerce players showing Affirm at checkout. So we're acquiring this deluge of new customers, but very few of them are taking out second and third loans. So this is a big business problem that we were conquering. It was called activation, the group that we were really focused on there. So activating users into the Affirm network. So what people would typically do is they would install the Affirm app in order to manage their payments, to make sure that they're making their payments on time. They're not going to have anything that hurts their credit score. Super
Hmm.
smart. At the same time, then they would always enable push notifications. So when you looked at the Affirm app, we had a ton of monthly active users with push notifications enabled, and we had this
Hmm.
business problem. What else did we have? We always asked people for their location after I joined. So we started opting in like roughly like 10 to 15% of the users into location sharing as well.
Hmm.
So we had like huge push notification opt in, huge location sharing opt in at that point. So we wanted to build a feature where if you go to an Affirm merchant, let's say you go to a shopping center where there is a Nike nearby, and there's, maybe like Nike and Reebok, for instance, it might
Hmm.
influence your decision if we say like at Nike, you can pay in four installments with 0% interest. That can be
Hmm.
super interesting for you, right? So we
Yeah.
had this idea like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do like geolocation pushes in order to drive activation. So this is the feature that we wanted to build. And for us, the solutioning process in terms of where build versus buy would come in is how do we implement that geolocation, right? How do
Yeah.
we know what stores are nearby, where people are? And so that was where the build versus buy came in.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty tricky problem, but also a problem that I feel like a lot of like technical engineers would be just like drooling over to solve, right? It's like it's got like geospatial like map data that needs to go in there. It's got real-time notification data that needs to go in there, intent data, and then how do you solve this problem and bundle it to become a cohesive product or a driver of growth for you guys? Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached that decision making process? Like, what was what were the requirements, right? Like you described the product feature, but like what were like the growth metrics that you were looking for, and how did you think about the pros and cons? What was the framework you were using to kind of identify with the right solution?
Yeah. So in terms of the growth metrics, the goal was that we had like these pretty high performing pushes, for instance, related to repayments, right? So
Mhm.
something like 50, 60% of these pushes were getting clicked on. Insane, right? So the goal was to even get to like maybe 75% of that or
Mhm.
50% of that. Like we would have been happy with that. We had pushes that were performing much worse when you think about like merchandising related pushes, like, this is Expedia's latest deal that Expedia paid us to send out or something like
Yeah.
that. So we had like something that's like contextual, useful, important. So what we need to do then to break that down, right? If we're going to get people to actually click on this in order to increase more people in the app, first we need to be sending them data that's really timely, right? Because
Mhm.
if you walk into a shopping center and it's an hour later that we're sending you this information, you're on your way out.
Yeah.
On the top of that, we need to have really up to date data on like what stores exist and whether the stores are open, because there's really no reason on a Sunday for us to send you to Chick-fil-A.
Mhm.
So we need to have quite a bit of data actually about where retailers are located.
Yeah.
And I need to have this fundamental data set of what their hours are. And then we need to be able to tie that data back to our database to see like what types of loan offers we can give people and which ones would be exciting. People actually do pay for groceries for a birthday party. You have
Uh,
to spend $450 for a big
yeah.
family cookout or something. They will use Affirm Pay in 4 for that. Yeah, and we're okay with that as long as, Affirm has pretty high standards for the types of
Mhm.
people it'll give out that type of a loan to. So the the thing was we needed to have really good location data, really good retailer data, really good geolocation data. If you think about those as the three most technical requirements,
Mhm.
then our teams, like luckily with the iOS and Android SDK, is like a lot of the geolocation stuff compared to 12 years ago is like already built in there. They could just build
Yeah.
atop that. So that's one component knocked off. There is some sort of UX challenge around getting people to opt into location for the 85% of MAU that we hadn't already asked that for,
Mhm.
but we were like well on our way. So that was one component, but the real component then is like the store data, right? Where who
Yeah.
has data on retailers and that's so geolocation precise, right?
Yeah.
So that like we don't want to send you like there's some big malls out there. We don't want to send you across the mall. It just that's not a relevant push anymore.
Mhm.
So we need to have like very precise data that can work with what's coming out of iOS and Android. So at the end of the day, there were really just three options. Like one, we could use like our internal databases and enrich those internal databases, but that would be pretty expensive and it wouldn't be an engineering effort. It'd be like a
Mhm.
maps sort of effort.
Yeah.
Or we could buy one of two providers basically. That market is dominated by like two companies, Foursquare and another one which I forget. And so we basically were like, okay, do we build this? Probably not. We have
Yeah.
to buy this because, right, the amount of money, the amount of time, and most importantly, the expertise doesn't exist on our team today. So
Mhm.
we did have people who could build really technical systems that operate really at speed, right? Because we're supporting Amazon checkout. Like we
Yeah.
can do all of that stuff. So we could do the geolocation side, but it was the store data side that it was like, we probably need to buy this. Then there was like some talk of, okay, we could build on top of this with some of the free maps APIs. So I thought, so
Yeah.
me and the tech leads and the directors of engineering, we're like, oh, it's all buy, right? But then somebody actually came in and said, like, there is a build option. And
Mhm.
so then what we did is we asked one of our like senior staff engineers who's really good at this sort of architecture stuff to take a look at it. And so
Yeah.
he really put his thinking cap on. I think it only took him like half a day in the end of it because he's so senior, but he just created like a table. He created clarity through chaos, right? And he put it out for everybody. Like, this is my estimate of if we were to build on top of these Google Maps APIs, like, first
Mhm.
of all, number one, or not actually Google Maps. It's the one Apple Maps uses because that's the one that's open source. I think it's called like OpenGL Maps or something like that.
Yeah. Mapbox or
So,
something like that. Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
So he said, like, there's we can build upon. This is like the quality delta that I expect. He actually took like 1,000 data points and sent them over to those two data providers and got back their data versus the maps data. So he like queried all three of these APIs
Mhm.
and he showed us like, okay, this was the performance. So basically he gave us an assessment of the cost and the performance, and
Mhm.
ultimately like cost and performance were in favor of buying one of the solutions.
Yeah.
So then over the next 6 months we pitched the two companies against each other with like round after round after round of negotiation.
Got it. Got it. So I guess like we'd love to understand a little bit more. You said cost and the quality, I believe, right? Like are the two things that are much better from the paid providers. how did you evaluate that? Like, how did you I mean, it seems somewhat subjective, maybe more data points or, like, accuracy, like, how did you validate that the data was actually better? And then from a cost perspective, I mean, it's hard to beat open source. So, what was the cost vector that you were thinking about? Was it really just human hours building it or yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yes, human hours building and then maintaining such a
Mhm,
system, because it's not actually like it's not plug and play off those OpenGL Maps APIs. There's a data engineering component of connecting it, for instance, like I mentioned, to like the times the stores are open. There's a
mhm,
component around making sure that it's always up to date and like repinging back the GL Maps API to get updates. It wasn't like it didn't have like a system to tell us like we've changed this retailer or something like
mhm,
that, right? So we would have to periodically go in and check those out. So it was basically we were creating like a team essentially. We were either going to commit to having a team that we'd have to maintain this service
mhm,
for, or especially because I led the growth teams, like we usually didn't want to maintain big expensive services like that. We just want to go out and experiment in other features later. Or we could just there's these companies, these two companies that's all they do.
right.
So we'd get the benefit of them thinking about it, constantly updating it on their own. And they had a bunch of functionality. So within the quality, if you break it down like
Mhm,
from the high level, right? The maps data is architected for figuring out like how you get from point A to point B. Their
mm,
data is architected for figuring out what retailers exist where. So literally like the architecture of how they're updating everything and creating everything is totally purpose built different, which means
mhm,
that when he pulled those 1,000 samples, this senior staff engineer, what he was looking at was, okay, how close were they to the stores? And he would go verify it using like actual information. So he would look at like, okay, the the Foursquare data, for instance, I remember he was saying like we can get it within like 10 meters or something
mm,
like that, versus like the maps data was more accurate to just like the overall location, like
mhm.
within the shopping center. So that was one of the key factors then that we said, okay, we really do care like if you're near Nike or if Nike's on the other side of the mall. So that's the other component of quality.
Interesting, because I feel like the maps data, especially if it's like point A to point B, somebody presumably knows where they're going and they would type in that location, so they very, very explicitly specify that. Whereas for you guys, the location services are not super pinpoint accurate on these devices, and depending on like what level of service they grant you, you might have the radius as to what the location of the person could be quite large. So having a system or having a data set and a system around that data set that could help you, you know, maybe do you remember how it got to be so accurate? Was it like heuristics or like how do they know exactly the location that an individual was standing in order to then provide or surface the best retailers around them? Do you remember how they did that?
As far as I understand it, like there's just two inputs to that. So they use like the
Mhm.
three closest cell towers and then they triangulate and then they use the like gyroscope function within the phone. So
Oh, interesting.
that's how so like as you're like walking in with between they like make an estimate. So it's
Got
like, so like if you're like shaking your phone a lot and stuff, it becomes less accurate. If you have like a young kid holding it, like
it.
just holding it versus like having an adult in their bag or pocket, it also makes a difference.
Got it. Interesting. I would have assumed GPS data to start, but I guess GPS is slow, so it's probably like not. It takes a while to acquire that signal initially. Interesting. That's super fascinating because I assume a lot of this stuff was baked into how the Foursquare data set was presented back to you. Like I didn't even think about that. That's fascinating in terms of just like the data structure that underlies the system is very important to how you build and how fast you can build and how much effort it is to maintain it long term.
100%.
Cool. So I guess Affirm is still around. They're a fairly large company, and I guess do you know if this product is still being run the way you built it? Has it been modified a bit? What were some of the trade offs that you made when building this product, and do you know if those trade offs have been addressed or changed since you've moved on?
Gosh, I don't know. I think all the PMs that still worked on it are still there, so I could probably ping them and figure it out, but I have gotten push messages from Affirm, so I know that as a user, the
Uh-huh.
end result of having location-based push is still there. When we looked at the results for this feature, it was like one of the best performing features that we built that quarter across the various growth teams that I led. So, in terms of that like activation rate North Star, it was something in the range of statistically significant, like 6 or 7%. And
Mhm.
increasing activation 6 or 7% is like a direct improvement to LTV, which
Yeah.
like allows us to subsidize the Amazon and Shopify deals that we created. So a pretty big, monetary impact on like a $1.25 billion company. So in terms of annual revenue that we were having at the time. So it was
Yeah.
working, it worked really well. So the team has maintained it because of that. I remember like most of the trade-offs that I feel like that I was involved in as a head of product growth were a little bit less technical and a little bit more UX related. So
Mhm.
I brought up a couple different times like how important it is to have the store really close to you. I remember like I was
Mhm.
when we were beta testing this feature and it was in test flight on my phone, I would just go to different shopping centers, and that was always my feedback to the team is like I'm standing in front of this retailer that I know we have a relationship with, but
Yeah.
you guys have decided that like I'm more interested in this retailer way over there. It's
Yeah.
like, no, like probably like send me the push for the retailer here, or maybe like we could have like a link. So one thing we tested but ultimately didn't graduate was having a link to like all their retailers nearby you.
Mm.
Another thing we tested that we ultimately didn't graduate was having like a module in the app at all times, kind of showing you like, oh, these are the 5 retailers that you can use Affirm at that are closer to you. Like
Mhm.
ultimately what we did graduate, what we found was most incremental was right near you, right when you're
Mhm.
traveling. Like, you're walking by American Eagle. It's like, oh, I have actually no, American Eagle is a bad example. So like purple mattress, that's often
Okay.
in a lot of malls now, right? So
Yep.
that's like pretty expensive for you to go after like a $4,000 mattress. And people really care about buying power. So,
Mhm.
when you're paycheck to paycheck, like many Affirm customers, maybe your buying power in a particular 2 week period is like $300. That's like your
Yeah.
cushion, right? So you'd never buy something over $300. But all of a sudden we send you a message, oh, you can pay $250 every 2 weeks for 16 weeks
Mhm.
and you can buy a $4,000 bed. Now people
Mhm.
are super excited about that, right? So it's fitting within their margin of cushion and we've told them about it. So we actually did stuff like that where it was so effective where like our merchants would actually come to us and be like, can we do more geolocation pushes? We'll pay for you to do like specifically us as a merchant. So that
Yeah.
proximity was one of the big sort of trade-off calls we had to make. Another one was like around timing and frequency.
Yeah.
So timing, like, how quickly should we be sending it? And then frequency, how often should we send such a push to person? Like, should we ever send like 2 within 1 visit or 2 within 1 day? So thinking about those caps, ultimately we decided to like test into those caps, not send more than one per visit, which meant
Mhm.
that then the intent data of like what retailer at that um, area they're most likely to buy from. And again, we're talking about customers with just one purchase with Affirm. So we don't actually know that much about them. If they bought an electronics product, does that necessarily mean they're more likely to buy another electronics product? Actually, it turns out no, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes it just means they're most likely to buy a product at the biggest retailer there. So oftentimes it would be like Apple. Right.
Yeah.
Apple is like where everyone buys from. And so it always want to send people Apple pushes. And so we had to pull back from that and say, like, well, if we've sent a user 2 Apple pushes, then we should probably suggest a different retailer next time they go to that shopping center. So as a product leader, that's where I really double clicked in. As we graduated, I started to see like, okay, we're sending a lot of these pushes. How do we make sure that those pushes are still effective over time? Because we naturally, like any growth channel, you start to see that decreasing
Yeah.
effectiveness in the channel. It worked really good when you A/B tested it. Then you roll it out and you start to see like, head scratcher. Like I'm not getting, the 60, 70 million that I thought I'd be getting in bottom line revenue. And so why? So that's where I tended to plug in. I do know that the big trade off that the team was making technically was more in that time. So I
Mhm.
believe like at the time we were using like SendGrid, I think, for our
Yeah.
SMSs to people. And they realized like to have the coverage that we wanted across, at the time we were operating in UK, Canada, and US and do it really quickly, we need to switch over to Twilio, but Twilio was like 100 times more expensive. So
Mhm.
then we had to negotiate with Twilio to get it down. Once we got it down to just like 2 or 3 times more expensive, then we had this trade off of like, is that cost worth it for us? And
Mhm.
ultimately, like we did go with Twilio just because we found that that speed was so useful for us.
Interesting. I would love to dig a little bit more into the frequency question that you just brought up, as well as the intent, because, like, of course, on the one hand, depending on how your incentives or your metrics were set up, you could be incentivized to send a ton of these push notifications. But how many large purchases is an individual going to be making on a particular visit to the mall, right? So, would love to understand how you one decided, not just frequency, but like which one, given that you mentioned one a day or one a visit, right? Like, which one do you push, right? And was there any testing done around, like, hey, maybe we could do two, or maybe it's like Black Friday, so like Apple is running a sale and Purple Mattress, so like we do two. Was there any testing around like scenarios where you could do more than one a day or one a visit?
Yeah, and so when you think about growth at a firm, our key guardrail metric is like repayment rates. We never want to grow GMV loans while
Hmm.
decreasing repayment rates. And in the environment we're talking about 2021, 2022 when rates were tightening, that was even more so the case because we
Yeah.
could predict that our lending standards were going to get tighter over time. So, with all of that in mind, right? It never actually makes sense to have any Affirm customer have too much loan amount out at any given time. You
Hmm.
don't want them to have three loans that are like at the 95% of the purchasing power we're willing to lend to them. It's much better to have it at like 50% of the purchasing power they're willing to. So the first most important thing for us was having really smart targeting of who we're willing to even send these pushes to. Now that
Mm.
we know that these pushes work, we need to have smart targeting about that. So that was actually the most effective thing for us in frequency was thinking through like, okay, we with people who are using 0 to 30% of their purchasing power, that's like the sweet spot. So for
Mhm.
those people, like we're willing to send more, but as soon as they like start getting up in purchasing power, for instance, they converted on one of these pushes, we
Yeah.
really want to tamp it down. In fact, we might just want to stop it. And so that's what we did is we created these limits on how much of your available purchasing power did you use. So that was
Mhm.
actually the most effective thing when you looked at the frequency charts of like what stopped us from sending it too much. Now the other thing you mentioned is too little, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're on Black Friday and you're shopping all day, how do we think about that? So we did have the growth PM who initially launched this did have a hypothesis around sending it to more people, and she did want to test into it. But like everything else, prioritization, we started to see bigger features elsewhere. We stopped
Yeah.
iterating on this feature, at least when I was there. So for almost a year, it kind of just stayed dormant at that one per day limit.
Got it. It's interesting. You mentioned something that I didn't realize about Affirm. It's like there is essentially an amount of credit that you're willing to extend to a customer, and as they pay that down, that credit then becomes freed up. So in a lot of ways, in my mind, Affirm has always been kind of like a, let's call it, point loan, a loan for a specific item, right? But the way you guys were thinking about it, managing it internally, it sounds like more like a revolving line of credit where as long as they were paying off that loan, you could send a push notification to allow them to then utilize the freed up portion of their credit to then reuse, which is yeah, I never actually didn't realize that. Like 30% to me, it just like in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what credit cards want. They want you to use about credit utilization around 20 to 30%, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of masked behind this like specific purchase that a firm was loaning against.
Yep.
Fascinating stuff. Um, Awesome. Well, that was super interesting, kind of just like learning about this growth feature, because it's definitely one of those things that it feels like if you weren't careful about it, both in building, creating the feature, and you bought the data, but in creating the feature and then utilizing the feature, you could have really gotten yourself or a firm in some hot water just from the extension of credit perspective, adoption perspective, annoyances perspective. Like if those push notifications became too frequent, I'm sure a lot of people would just turn them off. But yeah, I'm really glad we were able to kind of dive into the thought process there and how you guys designed that feature. Anything you want to add on that before we kind of move on to the last part?
Yeah, I would just double click on what you said that As you're building growth, always think about the flip side. That's the thing I always tell growth leaders is like sometimes you're just handed a North Star metric and you just want to do anything you can to move that North Star metric. But
Hmm.
yeah, always thinking about the repayment side and think about it early because the last thing you want as a product leader or an engineer is like you create the PRD, you create the spec, you put it out on test flight for your execs, and then some exec in the repayment side of the business is like, hey, did you think about this? And you're like,
Yeah.
no, we didn't. That's the worst scenario. So luckily, we had a great ICPM on there who she thought about it from the beginning.
Yeah. And yeah, it does feel like, with any growth channel, any growth mechanism, there is a level of saturation. And when you start hitting that level of saturation, you really need to figure out what's next, how to pare down what you're doing in order to then reach the next level. I'm just reminded of like Nike, right? Like where recently they really went hard on the online and kind of like retail shop kind of model where they own the retail stores, and now we know they just changed CEOs because that channel grew really big in the pandemic era, but has since just kind of like hit a wall. And it seems like he just kind of completely missed that at a certain point that saturation level will be hit, and it could be a cliff on the other side of it, right? So interesting.
Yes. It's like the law of shitty click throughs, is what Andrew Chen calls it. Every growth channel, as you scale it up and use it longer, it has diminishing returns.
Yeah.
Perhaps the only one that doesn't is brand advertising. And that Nike CEO made a huge mistake by cutting out brand advertising in favor of all that direct response.
Right. Cool. Well, maybe to wrap it up, we always love to ask our guests to share something that they've been working on that they're excited about, whether it's personal or professional or both, Yeah. So if you could share something with the audience on what you're working on today, that's really exciting for you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm working on a post with Anvil actually today. So the post is about what your biggest weakness is. And I think that it's just so important for what I do in a lot of my product management work is I will mentor like career PMs who are looking
Hmm.
for their next job, or they're looking for, where they should move internally with the next big company that they work at. And what I consistently find is that people don't know what their biggest weaknesses actually are.
Hmm.
So, for instance, they'll be able to say, like, I'm a PM, I've been at Google for 8 years and I've worked on search that for those 8 years. Okay. So
Hmm.
then, like, what are your big weaknesses? Like, it seems like all the features you've worked on are maybe like really user facing. So, have you actually worked on like highly technical features, or have you worked on really AI features? And if they want to move their job, like in PM, AI is like the current trend. So, like, they need
Yeah.
to get some AI experience. But the systems they worked on weren't the AI features, they were just these UX things. So then that's their biggest weakness. Or a lot of people I work with, like they might have gotten laid off.
Hmm.
And I'll ask them, what's your biggest weakness? And they'll mention something else like, oh, I don't have enough e-commerce experience. Usually, if you've been laid off, like your layoff is your biggest weakness for that next job. That's the area that people are like, so you weren't a top performer at X company. Will you be a top
Hmm.
performer here? So I feel like a lot of people, when they're thinking about their careers and career growth, they lack that ability to understand what their biggest weakness really is. And so
Hmm.
for me, that is like an area I've been very passionate about. And for this piece, we kind of walk through with a bunch of real people how I identified what their weakness was and why
Hmm.
they got what their weakness was wrong.
Interesting. No, I mean, I feel like we all tend to make up stories for ourselves in terms of how we see the world or how we see ourselves, and that can create blind spots, right? And I'll tell you one thing: your biggest weakness is not because I try too hard, I work too many hours, which is always the joke, right? In an interview, that's awesome. So you're working with a couple of professionals, a handful of professionals at any given point in time to help them and coach them in their PM career, and that sounds like something that really gives you a lot of energy. It sounds like it's something that you really enjoy doing.
Yeah, and it keeps me connected. What's the
Yeah.
biggest knock against like business influencers after they go full time is like you're disconnected from the function. And so for me, it's like very, very important, just like a typical good PM would do, like know your users. And so in this
Hmm.
case, like talking to my users for a couple hours every day keeps me connected.
Awesome. And then last question is share a product you've recently purchased, either loved it or hated it. And yeah, just let us know what it is and why you loved it or why you hated it.
Sure. So, product I recently paid for is a Riverside Pro plan. So we're actually recording this on Descript's podcast. So I don't know if this is a rip on them, but Riverside Pro Plan is awesome. I'm super impressed with the functionality that they're willing to give away for like so little per month cost. And
Hmm.
I think that the aha moment for me has just been looking at the quality of the transcript, the quality of the editor that they have, the quality of their Magic Clip solutions, the
Hmm.
ability to get the source record file at 4K 48 hertz audio for basically unlimited podcasts. Like I'm doing like, like 9 to 10 hours of podcast recording a week, and I'm able to
Hmm.
get like all 40 to 50 hours of that in source native with like a live stream client that works pretty well, streams at 720p, all the while recording at 4K. So, yeah, I love latest updates. The PM team has good work there.
Nice. So it sounds like usability, the accessibility of the features in terms of just like price point, and also giving you everything you need as a professional content creator that to really create the content that you want, right? So that's like sounds like a pretty strong endorsement of Riverside.
So far, so good.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Akash, it has been a pleasure speaking with you today. Really learned a lot about your experience at Affirm. I'm sad we didn't get more time to dive into your other experiences, but we only have so much time on this podcast. We'll probably have to have you back on at a later point.
Would love to. Thanks so much for bringing back those good memories. That was a fun feature to work on.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks again, and we'll release this podcast soon. Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.